Welcome. My name is David Hart, and it's a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of ITIF to today's panel on finding the consensus on clean energy. I know it's a very quiet day here in Washington, so I know it's no cost for you guys to come on over here, but I appreciate you taking the time out of the day to join us. We don't have the slide projector, so hopefully everybody got a set of slides. If you don't, we'll get them in here to spread them around. So I'm a professor at George Mason University at the Schar School of Policy and Government and a senior fellow at ITIF, which stands for Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. ITIF is a think tank. That means it's independent and nonprofit and nonpartisan. Its focus is on innovation and productivity and trying to spur growth, opportunity, and progress by providing policymakers with advice that they can trust. So that's what we're up to. And in clean energy, this is a program that I revived over the last year. Had been going for a few years and then a couple of years of dormancy. And so I jumped in just in time for things to really settle down. So it's been interesting and it's exciting, and I want to thank Rob Atkinson, who's the president and CEO of ITIF, for supporting the work and engaging on these issues, and also the ITIF staff, Samantha Green, Harry Klapsis, who are here today, really helped out getting things together. So today's session, it was sparked by a remarkable map, which I guess you can't see, but you'll have in your packets, and Ed will talk about. It shows that there's extraordinary public support for clean energy R&D, 82% nationally, and majorities not just in every state, but in every congressional district, in every county. So there's a heat map there, and it is just smoking hot. It's red, it's orange, there's a little yellow, but no blue. And when Rob Atkinson and I saw it and talked about it, we thought, well, we really need to get the word out up here. So that's the purpose today, and that led me to invite Ed Maybach to join us and be the featured speaker today. Ed is a university professor at George Mason in a different unit from me. He's the director of the Center for Climate Change Communication, and he has research which he'll talk about today, which is funded by National Science Foundation, by NASA, and a variety of private sources. And I'm especially grateful to him because he passed up an opportunity to speak at Harvard today. So thank you, Ed, for coming to Capitol Hill rather than Harvard. I think it shows that your loyalties are in the right place. He has a PhD from Stanford, and there's a lot more to say about him, but I'll let you go on his website and check out his bio if you want to learn more. After we hear from Ed, we'll have a panel discussion. I'll introduce the speakers for that when we get to that, and we'll have some crosstalk on the panel, and then open it up for your questions. So please think of questions to ask, and we look forward to engaging with you. So Ed, you are up. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And thank you all for coming this afternoon. I have a partnership with Tony Leiseritz at the Yale School of Forestry and Environment. For the past 10 years, we have been conducting every 6 months, we conduct a public opinion poll. We call this poll Climate Change in the American Mind. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to both explore sort of new emerging issues and public reactions to them, as well as to track public opinion over time. As sort of a spin-off of that project, Tony has created his own little radio series. It runs on public radio stations around the country. It's called Climate Connections. And just as luck would have it, today's Climate Connections segment was about a piece of research. I didn't catch who the researchers were, but I do remember clearly what they found. They went to the voter registration polls. They found who has been donating to Republican and Democratic candidates. They took that information at the street level. They then looked at those people's homes with Google Earth, and they scored each home as to whether or not it had a solar panel. Okay? So over 1 million, not only voters, but 1 million donors to Republican or Democratic candidates. And the question is, are they voting with their feet for or against clean energy in the form of solar for their own home? And the answer was no difference, no difference. Democrats and Republicans in every region of the country very similar rates of installing home solar. So I am a trained behavioral scientist. I always take with a grain of salt what people tell me, but I take as the literal truth what I can actually observe that people do. We aren't necessarily very good at even having insight into knowing why we do what we do, but what we do is consequential. So the fact that that to me is the strongest prima facie evidence that I can imagine that there's that we are in agreement. Sort of the topic of our conversation today, where's the political consensus on clean energy policy? Well, it begins with the fact that Democrats and Republicans are acting in a similar manner with regard to home installation of solar. So I'm going to go through, use the data that Tony and I collect, the Climate Change in the American Mind data, to speak to 2 points. And rather than have you look at little tiny squished up versions of my slides, I'm just going to ask you to listen to me. You can trust me that what I say is on the slides and you can look at it later. But if you're all looking down, I'm going to become really demoralized. So it's much better for you to maintain eye contact with me to keep me going on my mission here. So the first question I'm going to answer is on what do we agree with? Or where is the consensus with regard to clean energy policy? The second question I'm going to answer is where do we disagree? Or on what do we disagree? And then finally, I want to close with some really great polling that I take no credit for. Our fellow panelist, my fellow panelist, Rich Powell from ClearPath, this is a poll that he commissioned from 3 really fine polling organizations, and what they found was excellent research, and what they found was very insightful. So I'll close with that. So the first point I want to make, on what do we agree? Well, I'm actually going to start at the 60,000 foot level. And the 60,000 foot level politically right now is, how do we feel about major investment in American infrastructure? That's sort of a fundamental topic of conversation, not necessarily today, but in this political season. And so in our last poll, we asked people, do you support a major investment in infrastructure? The answer is yes, in overwhelming numbers across the political spectrum at more or less, and to a more or less an equal degree. We asked that question largely because we were interested in asking another follow-up question. The follow-up question is, okay, what infrastructure would you like to see rehabilitated? And the answer in response to that question is roads and bridges were the top priority. Actually, roads and bridges and our nation's water systems were 1 and 2. That wasn't our interest, but that's what the data said. What we were interested in is public support for investing in rehabilitating or actually modernizing our energy infrastructure, our electrical grid. We were also interested in whether or not people would like to see massive development or major scale up of wind and solar, clean renewable energy as part of the infrastructure package. Those were priorities 3 and 4. And there really wasn't a lot of variation between Democrats and Republicans on that issue. So this is definitely a point that we agree about. Let's invest in our infrastructure. Part of that should be our energy grid. Another part of that should be scaling up wind and solar. We followed up with another question. I won't go into the details. I'll just say the pattern of findings were exactly the same. We asked people, after they told us the various items that they felt we should invest in as part of our infrastructure package, we asked them, of those items only, how much of the infrastructure investment dollar would you put to each of those priorities? Again, modernizing the energy grid and investing in wind and solar were numbers 3 and 4. So we asked a question a bit later in our fall survey, and by the way, this survey was conducted right after the election, 2 weeks after the election, so this is in the era of Trump. We asked the question, in the future, do you think the United States should use renewable energy sources less, more, or about the same as we do today? And we asked the same question with regard to fossil fuel resources, looking to ask perfectly honest questions in a perfectly balanced manner. We all, both Democrats and Republicans, wherever they are on the political spectrum, they all agree that we should be using more clean energy going forward. At very, very high levels of agreement. The lowest, conservative Republicans, is 74% agreement with that proposition. The highest is liberal Democrats at 88%. They're somewhat there's somewhat less agreement with regard to the proposition of using less fossil fuel going forward. Democrats absolutely on board with that proposition. Republicans more or less split on it, with a slight skew towards not supporting that. So strong agreement on scaling up clean energy, not such clear agreement with regard to phasing out fossil fuel energy. Then we ask a series of questions about the use of public land to do those things, to produce clean renewable energy and to produce fossil fuel energy. We actually don't say clean, we just say generate renewable energy on public land and drill and mine for fuels, drill and mine for fossil fuels on public land in the US. This supporting, generating renewable energy, incredibly high support. As a matter of fact, the highest level of support of any of the questions we ask, again, across the political spectrum. Real strong agreement that public lands are a place we should be creating more renewable energy. With regard to a couple of key other policies that we pulled on, funding, essentially funding R&D into clean energy, very high support across the board, no disagreement at all. Providing tax rebates for people who purchase energy efficient vehicles and solar panels, also very high support across the board. After that, once we start polling on more specific issues like regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant, we get high levels of support, but you begin to see a differentiation between Democrats and Republicans. We've also looked at whether or not Trump voters are somehow differentiate themselves with regard to their views about these issues. Trump voters pretty much track with other conservative-leaning Republicans. So on what don't we agree? Well, we don't agree on how high a priority climate change should be for Congress and the President. Very high rates of support for this being a high priority issue among liberal Democrats and moderate Democrats, reasonably high levels of support among moderate conservatives, but very low levels of support among moderate Republicans, but very low levels of support among conservative Republicans. There is also some disagreement about the proposition or the prospect for what the transition to clean renewable energy would do to our economy. We asked, do you think that accelerating the transition to renewable energy would essentially harm our economy, help our economy, or make no difference? And what we found is that conservative Republicans feel, just by a small margin, but by a small margin they do feel it would be harmful to the economy. From moderate Republicans all the way to the left, there's pretty strong agreement that the transitioning to clean energy would actually help our economy. Okay, so let me close with some thoughts about the ClearPath poll. I don't know the entire history of this polling. I'm pretty sure it started with some really serious listening groups around the country, focus groups or in-depth interviews where voters are allowed to talk. And good researchers are listening and really hearing how people think about the issue and talk about the issue. That kind of clever listening allowed them to ask questions or allowed them to identify policy propositions that had a greater than average chance of gaining traction. What they learned essentially is that voters, including conservative Republicans, so the entire political spectrum, voters think that clean energy keeps us healthier, more secure or safer, and more prosperous. So there's a whole lot going, even in the minds of conservatives, a whole lot going for the notion of ramping up or scaling up the production of clean energy. Rather than sort of get into sort of the nuances of some of these questions, I'll simply say that those three ideas, healthier, it's seen as clean energy is both seen as cleaner, as leading to healthier air and less pollution. So a real strong health benefit. It's seen as essentially stimulating the economy by encouraging innovation. So that's the prosperity theme. And it's seen as helping us to essentially break our dependence on foreign sources of fuel. So three really strong benefits that resonate across the political spectrum. The in this poll, they also asked people which of two fictitious candidates would they support. Candidate A tended to support a fairly mainstream liberal proposition about clean energy. Candidate B supported a proposition that sounded more like embracing those three themes. Really interesting to see how strong the support for candidate B's position was, even really across the political spectrum. So even among Democrats, when clean energy is essentially sold, or the proposition falls back on those three benefits, health, prosperity, and security, you get a wide majority of Americans saying, yep, that's the direction we should be going. So let me end by only showing you the heat map that David talked about. This heat map is generated from the fact that Tony and I have been using our polling data to downscale our public opinion measures into communities across the nation. So you can use these heat maps to look at 14 or 16 different indicators of public opinion in every congressional district in America. So for those of you who are particularly concerned about how your district is netting out on these issues, I encourage you to go to the Yale Climate Opinion Maps, because that's where you can find this information. So with that, I would like to call my colleagues up to the stage, and we will engage with you in a conversation, hopefully addressing the questions that are of most interest to you.
Thank you, Ed. So, as I mentioned, we have a couple of panelists here today, and I asked them to join us in part because I know they disagree on certain things, but we're here to find out what we agree on and where the consensus is. And I think if we can find some consensus with this group, we might go some distance towards finding a consensus that Congress can also agree on. So for this, I guess to my left, Rich Powell is the Executive Director at the ClearPath Foundation and ClearPath Action. ClearPath was founded by Jay Faison, and its mission is to accelerate conservative clean energy solutions. And Rich is the leader of that group in the areas of policy and strategy, which includes educating policymakers about energy innovation, which I think this event qualifies for. And he also leads ClearPath's external advocacy and research partnerships with nonprofits, academia, and the private sector. And then second to my left is Rob Cowan. He's the Director of Government Affairs for the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. UCS's mission is to put rigorous independent science to work to solve our planet's most pressing problems, including notably for our discussion here today, making the global energy system cleaner. And Rob leads UCS's efforts here in the U.S. to shape federal policy, including tax policy, infrastructure policy, and innovation policy, all of which we heard a little bit about from Ed. So Ed's gotten the conversation off to a great start, and we didn't decide who's going to go first, so we'll start with Rich since he's the furthest away from me. So Rich Powell.
Great. Do I need to press this?
Yeah, you should.
Great. Well, first, thank you to David and ITIF for arranging this really important and I think a very timely event. Obviously, it's a busy life in DC, but this is a timely event as we're sort of coming into appropriation season, amongst other things. And thank you so much to Ed for sharing that research, for giving a shout out to the ClearPath research as well. I think it's incredibly valuable to remind us of just where the public stands on this, because obviously that is foremost in the mind of anybody. Actually, can I just get started to calibrate who in the room is congressional staff? And so obviously this is public support is a very important thing to your respective bosses, or at least if they're good at staying in their seats, it's a very important thing, right? So the first thing you look at when you're looking at an issue like this is this going to get me into trouble, right? Is this something that'll be in some way contentious with my voters? And I think what we can see very definitively from this body of research is that this is not just something that won't get anybody into trouble, but in fact it's something that's a sort of a pretty clear winner across the board with virtually every sector of society. I also think, and particularly we're a conservative organization, I think a lot of conservatives have some fear about talking about clean energy because they feel like it necessarily ties them to something like the Clean Power Plan or a broader agenda. And I think what this polling shows is that it very much does not, right? That you can have a very different feeling about, say, climate change, but still be very supportive of clean energy for a variety of reasons. So, you know, we kind of know that this is, it's not going to get anybody into trouble. In fact, it is a proactively good thing to talk about with virtually all voters. Okay, well, so then what do you do with it, right? What are the policy agendas that are open right now in this space? And so, you know, first and foremost, I would say this is a good thing for your bosses to be talking about, right? It's something that should be, you know, on office sites. It's something your boss should have a proactive position around. It's something that should be regularly in speeches and op-eds. Again, it's a winner. Innovation is a winner. Clean energy is a winner. Second, obviously, we're coming into appropriations season. I think DOE appropriations, if you don't have a lab in your district or don't have some other clear DOE tie, can often sort of get lost and sort of get down to the bottom of the list. But I think Bob and I would certainly agree that this is something that, you know, shouldn't be at the bottom of the list. In fact, we would, I at least would hope that it's toward the top of the list in terms of priorities. And we would say, you know, not to forget the applied end of that spectrum, right? That there's a strong and robust role for the federal government at all levels of the DOE funding stream. Of course, that decreases over time when you get further from basic and more toward applied. But we should all just remember that, you know, if we're only doing basic research and not doing any applied research, our competitors sure are doing a lot of applied research. And if we're only doing basic and they're doing a lot of applied and a lot of tech to market, we're essentially doing welfare for China and India and their economies, right? And that's not a strong use of American taxpayer dollars, right? We need to make sure that this actually builds industries here in America. So, you know, beyond appropriations, obviously there's quite a bit of legislative activity around the innovation space just in the past year. I'll call out a couple of things. The Energy Policy Modernization Act, which I think was what we were calling it on the Senate side last year. We were describing it as an innovation bill. It had a number of very strong innovation provisions, particularly after it made it through the amendment process on the floor. It included expansions in authorization for ARPA-E. It included things on reauthorizing clean coal, clean fossil research. It had the NIICA, Nuclear Energy Innovation Capabilities Act, amended into it, which set up a test bed for advanced nuclear reactors out of the Idaho National Lab. It even had marine hydrokinetic research. If you believe waves are the future, it had something for you. So the getting supportive of this next wave of trying to get the energy bill across the finish line, which I know is a top priority for Senate ENR, is very important, as are a number of the other they call more rifle shot bills that are going to be moving through this year. I particularly call out the Nuclear Energy Innovation Modernization Act that streamlines the licensing process for advanced nuclear reactors. Extremely important given the current state of the NRC. Lincoln Collar, who's in the audience at NuScale, can attest to how difficult it is to move a new nuclear reactor design through that process right now, and not all our companies are as well situated as hers to move those designs. So that bill is extremely important, as is the very bipartisan America Innovates Act. That's Senator Rubio and Coons's bill, respectively, on reforming the way the national laboratories do business, getting rid of a lot of the unnecessary bureaucracy and red tape, making the dollars that we spend there higher leverage. Lastly, I would say this is a very open space and sort of lots of room for new ideas and new legislation. There's lots of unclaimed territory, and I just sort of, you know, assembled a quick list on this. But there's quite a bit that could be done in any upcoming infrastructure package on innovation, right? There's both targeted spending that could occur at the national laboratories on this. In particular, I point out, say, an actual authorization for an advanced reactor test bed out of the Idaho National Lab. We think that there's a lot of potential in grand challenge type initiatives at the National Lab. On the renewables side, the Sunshot initiative was very helpful in deeply decreasing the costs of solar energy, but we don't really have that kind of grand challenge type work right now anywhere on the baseload clean energy side. So we don't have a grand challenge for advanced nuclear. We don't have a grand challenge for third generation carbon capture. and making sure that we find alternative uses of carbon dioxide when we start to take it out of power plants. We don't have a grand challenge for grid scale storage. So if you care about renewables and you want renewables to really get up to high penetration in our economy, we're not really working on the grid scale batteries that are going to make that possible in any really big, robust way at the national labs. All of which I think would make great new authorizations on that side. Obviously, there's quite a bit to be done on vehicles as well, and quite a bit to be done on improving the way the laboratories transfer technology into the private sector. We're lucky to have Joanna Wilson in the room who runs technology transfer at EERE. They've done some great things there, which could be applied to some of the other applied offices, especially fossil and nuclear, to make sure that those innovations are getting off the shelf and out of the lab and into the private sector. So I'll stop there with my idea party here. But thank you all very much for coming, and look forward to having a discussion about policy opportunities in the space.
Thanks, Rich. Rob.
Thank you guys again for being here. Really appreciate it. Amazing research, and I think it should provide some measure of comfort to many of us who can maybe be disillusioned in this hyper-political and partisan environment. It's nice to see that some issues haven't been completely politicized, although I think we're giving it our best shot in some cases on clean energy. I remember when solar, it wasn't ideological, political kind of ideology associated with the way people looked at solar energy, wind energy, and people basically got behind, whether Republican or Democrat, this understanding of clean air energy, which we saw the polling actually bear out quite a bit. And then, now we've also moved into spaces where people like a certain energy pathway to get where they want to be, and it's got to be prescribed this way. And so now it's about 100% renewables, or somebody else who started off in the same place saying, we agreed on clean air energy, I like nuclear, I think CCS plays a role. No, it's got to be 100% renewables. Now you're politicizing the issues with respect to technology. At UCS, my organization, we're a science-based organization, and we're really interested in making sure that the climate issue and the clean energy issue is depoliticized, not more politicized. The Energy Policy Modernization Act, which Rich alluded to, was not a perfect bill in the eyes of any environmentalist, but it had some really important stuff in there with respect to grid modernization and energy efficiency, for example. Things that we really think is important that Congress legislate, and ultimately we were there on that bill when a lot of our allies were not, because they couldn't get past certain ideological issues associated with the bill with respect to certain technologies. And I think that's the kind of tough choices and common ground that we've got to find a way to forge and work together on, finding places that work for everyone. And so the polling tells us a lot, right? It tells us that across the spectrum we care about clean air energy. So getting less ideological about how that clean air energy is produced, I think is a necessity to be able to move forward in a bipartisan way. Clean energy innovation as well, and we've seen that really come into the forefront with the President's skinny budget, which of course, unfortunately really does call for some pretty vast cuts to the technology offices, for example, energy technology offices, including EERE, which we care a lot about, and of course, eliminating RPE, cutting back on energy innovation at a time when we need to be innovating our way out of this problem. We know that the regulatory pathways are closed to us from certain ideological perspectives. We know clean energy mandates are very hard to advance federally on the Hill, although they've done a really great job in states. Well, what are the pathways that are open to us to be able to make progress on the federal level? There's no doubt that funding for clean energy innovation, it's a pro-growth strategy. There's a lot of Republicans, including the chairmen of the appropriations committees and jurisdiction over these issues, that understand the value, the economic benefit that investing in clean energy R&D provides, that it is a proper role of government to get involved, especially in the early stages of this research and development, where we know the private sector is a little bit more risk averse because it's more risky at that point. That's precisely the time when we really need federal support to be put behind some of these technologies so that we can help innovate our way out of climate change. But one other thing that was very heartening was the tax code, the tax credit support that you see across the board, because something that I think people forget is actually one of the few ways we've made progress on climate and energy policy at the federal level. One of the few ways has actually been through the tax code, it's been through those tax credit extensions. It's also been through energy efficiency, but the tax credit's very important. And I think that still holds a lot of promise as we think about opportunities in the future. Maybe it has to be more of a technology neutral variety, less ideological or prescriptive with respect to technologies, in the sense of we want zero carbon technologies, low carbon technologies. But I think the opportunity is potentially there. And so I look forward to kind of doing the tough work of forging new ground and compromise with people that don't think like me, so that we can make progress. I'll just say lastly, we really see stagnation as just as bad as passing bad policy. We are up against a clock here from a science standpoint. We're very cognizant of the science, very cognizant of the range of risk, how that actually expands the further out that we don't actually reduce our emissions, that we don't deploy clean energy. And so doing nothing is really bad at passing imperfect policy. And so we're going to have to make some tough decisions, and people are going to have to think out of the box and be a little less ideological and more pragmatic. But I think there's common ground to do that. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rob. So I'm going to offer a few remarks here before I open it up for some conversation. So I brought along a prop. This is a book by Stephen Salvahera and David Kaniski, which came out in, I think, 2014. And it is an effort to collate all the public opinion on energy policy. And it's called Cheap and Clean. And that kind of sums up what Americans want out of our energy system, although I would add as well reliability. Some of you may recall the fate of Gray Davis, the governor of California, the first one to be recalled because of the electricity crisis that occurred out in California. So, but maybe cheap, clean, and reliable was too many words to put in the title. But Ed's findings are very consistent with this broader literature, and he adds a lot to it. And I guess I see it as the idea that renewables are no longer alternatives. So I was at the Home Depot the other day, and there's a little Solar City booth, and I could look at my house, and they could just estimate right there on the spot, you know, what the possibilities were for me. So that is the new mainstream, cheap, clean, and reliable. And I think the polling on R&D suggests that if policymakers can find ways to make the system cheaper, cleaner, and more reliable, they should do it. Americans are all for it. Now, how should we do it? That's our challenge. I mean, I see this consensus as a permissive consensus. Public opinion doesn't really care how we get there. That's our job as policymakers to figure that out. And for me, the key to getting results is about creating options. The more options, the better. It's about managing risk with our portfolio, and I realize that is like the most boring argument in the world. It's an insurance argument. But it's the only way to get consistent results. And if the public wants results, that's the way to give it to them. It's just like with stocks or with baseball pitchers. You guys are Nationals fans, any of you? We need a portfolio of pitchers in our bullpen. Righties, lefties, short men, long men. And we're not there yet with the Nats, but they have a farm system to try to do that. And it's true with energy options as well, right? A lot of things can go wrong when you move from something that's the gleam in an inventor's eye to large-scale deployment, whether it's the technology, whether it's behavioral responses, whether it's the cost, whether it's unexpected consequences. You need insurance, you need options, you need diversity so that if one option fails, and we know some of them will fail, you have others. So then the question is, how do we create these viable options? And this is where we might have some disagreement, though I'm in violent agreement with Rich on this. I think the federal government has a role to play through the whole spectrum of the sort of technology development. But the role of the public sector does change as you move from basic research, where there's a big role, to deployment, where there's a much smaller role and a much larger role for the private sector. But it's not black and white. It's not like there's projects that should be 100% public and then another space where there are projects that are 100% private and nothing in between. And this is, I think, a problem with our discourse these days. We have to think about a whole shade of grays and a handoff. We need public-private partnerships with varying degrees of public and private participation. So if we have demonstration projects where we want a bigger private share to address, Jim Connaughton, who works with CleanPath, calls it the dune of death. I love that phrase, as opposed to the valley of death, right? If you think about this big sand dune you have to get over with demonstration projects. Still, in that kind of closer to market application, there should be a smaller public role. And then with basic research at the labs and elsewhere, there needs to be a bigger public role. And then government needs to get out of the way when technologies mature, and that's something we're not as good at. I do think this challenge is greater in the energy sector, where we have to meet very challenging price and performance benchmarks that are established by incumbents. And so it takes more in this sector than in brand new high-tech sectors. But the benefits are great, right? Clean, cheap, reliable energy. It's something that we all take for granted. We need the lights to go on. Now, I do think we have to talk about reform as well as just, obviously, I think we should maintain the investment. We also need to get more bang for the buck, and again, my co-panelists have alluded to this. I think we need to have users play a stronger role in energy R&D to pull what they need from the innovation system, strengthening the labs, relationship between the labs and their surrounding economies, sustaining the tech transfer agenda. I do worry that that some of the new innovations will be the first ones on the chopping block, because that's kind of the way things go here. So ARPA-E, the Manufacturing Center, Cyclotron Row, the Office of Tech Transitions, all these innovations within the institutional structure of DOE and elsewhere, these are vulnerable because they're new and different. And I guess I would urge those of you who have some leverage with your bosses up here to pay attention to things that don't have necessarily such an established constituency as the older things. And then last, it's not just about taxing and spending, but there are also other tools, regulatory authority, legal authority, and spin-offs from national security. We need to think about DOD and the energy frame as well. So the public doesn't want us to waste money, but it does want us to continue to make the energy system cleaner, cheaper, and more reliable. And I don't think it would really cost us that much to do that. And we can get a lot out of a relatively modest investment to build this portfolio that I talked about. So those are my thoughts. Ed, I don't know if you want to respond or have any thoughts that were prompted by this discussion?
Just to elaborate one point, which is that, the word clean, what does that really mean to people? What it really means is healthful, healthy. At our research team, we were very interested in the public's views on global warming. We've segmented the public into 6 distinct groups, 6 distinct ways of thinking about this issue. They range from the alarm to the dismissive. The very first time I actually got to sit with members of the dismissive segment and interview them and ask them how they view climate change, how they view a whole variety of issues, including clean energy. Got a real earful in the most helpful manner. Members of the dismissive segment, in these were actually interviews we conducted on the mall in the Hirshhorn Sculpture Gallery, which turns out to be this incredible place to do marketing research because people from all over America stroll by and they're not particularly on the clock, and it's easy to lure them into a conversation. And you're sitting in that lovely place and the breeze is blowing and they really unburden themselves on you. It's just absolutely fantastic. And so members of the dismissive segment, by virtue of the fact that I was conducting these interviews, I think they probably knew what my views were, but when it came time to talk about the benefits of clean energy, essentially this is what I heard over and over and over again in their words. Look, I get the fact that fossil fuels are dirty. We burn them, we pollute our air and our water, it's bad for our health. So I'm all for cleaning up our fuel supplies as a way to clean our air and our water so my kid with asthma won't be as prone to having asthma attacks, and so that my father-in-law, who spends some portion of his time wearing an oxygen tank because he's got chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, this is going to allow him to have a higher quality of life in his so-called golden years. So even Americans who are really violently opposed to the proposition of global warming being a problem, they totally are on board with the health benefits of clean energy. And so cheap and clean requires just that little bit of unpacking as to what clean really means. We want it to be affordable, and we want it because we know it's good for our health.
I wanted to drill down as well on another term you mentioned, which is prosperous. So how do people think about the energy industry? Do they think about jobs? Do they think about how they use energy? Do you know more about what they think about when they use the term prosperous in this sort of cost of transition question?
Let Rich take the first shot at that because this was his research that I was talking about. And maybe then I will elaborate on his comments.
Yeah, so perhaps more than anything else, I think addition to the health benefits, conservatives in particular see upside from clean energy in economic opportunity and economic growth, right? The idea being that clean energy is innovative, this is something that spurs new technologies, new industries, and generally speaking, new industries are good and enrich us as a country, and ideally enrich us globally. And I think that's both a perception held by the public, and the good news is it's actually is it's true, right? So clean energy is one of the fastest growing global industries. By some counts, I think in the U.S., the clean energy industry writ large is now larger than, say, the aviation industry. So it is a major industry with a lot of jobs and a lot of opportunity and rapid growth in a way that many other industries in the U.S. are not growing. And so finding ways to harness that and use it to improve people's livelihoods, and then also ideally to improve our competitive posture to the rest of the world, which is increasingly an issue of concern. The rest of the world is decarbonizing. This is essentially a settled question, right? So really the only remaining question is who will capture the lion's share of that opportunity, right? China is running 1,000 miles an hour on this. They've had the largest solar panel manufacturers for a long period of time. I believe they now have the largest wind manufacturer. We still might beat them on things like advanced nuclear and carbon capture and some other things if we get really serious about these technologies really quickly. But otherwise, they stand well to sort of eat our lunch on this. And we're already buying our solar panels and a lot of our wind turbines from them. So really the question is can we keep up and capture this opportunity, or are we going to be left behind, as we've unfortunately been left behind in so many other places. Sorry, I went a little dark there.
We're only sunny here. This is a solar panel.
I want to add to that just a little bit.
Sorry.
For as bad a rap as science has been getting, or the purported lack of public trust in science and scientists as an institution, it's not true. It just isn't true. Look at the polling data. It's been National Science Foundation has science and technology indicators that go back 40, 50 years. The military and scientists, teachers, doctors, and nurses, they are in a category unto themselves in terms of public trust. So this whole notion of prosperity, I think, is in fact, and actually, so that's the science part. The technology part is you don't have to look beyond what we keep on the desks next to us or in our pocket. Everybody's got a really cool phone. We love our technology. So I don't actually have data to support this, but I'm willing to bet that if I were to go out and look, the data would this would be seen very clearly in what people tell us. They see fossil fuel as last century. They see renewable energy as this and next century. It's a more forward-looking, aspirational, way to power our lives, power our economy. The fact that so many Americans are expecting, wanting government help so that they can personally transition their own lives to renewable energy, because there is sometimes an upfront cost that is a little bit hard to bear. To me, that's a very, very strong vote. Even people who believe that we should be shrinking and not growing the size of government say they support this proposition that government should be helping us adopt these technologies so that we can personally benefit from them. So again, I really think that fundamentally it's a matter of sort of seeing a last century fuel versus a next century fuel, and the reliability issue is sort of where the issue that joins the two. Is the next century fuel reliable enough to really take over as the dominant way in which we run our lives?
Can I add one
Yeah,
thing to
please.
that? One place that I think we have an issue in the clean energy debate and a disconnect between public support and what we need on a policy level is around this issue of, sorry, I'm probably just not.
It's a little hard to see.
Sorry.
A little hard to see a little light.
And a place that I think we have a disconnect between public support today and where we need to be is particularly around the idea of clean fossil fuels, right? So every major energy modeler, right? So people who are looking at these issues of deep decarbonization says that carbon capture and clean fossil fuels are not a nice to have, they're a need to have. I think the IPCC says it's 160% more expensive to decarbonize the global economy without carbon capture than with carbon capture. Part of that's because of transportation, part of that's because of industrials, but it's very hard to take the CO2 out. So one thing that I think policymakers need to do, because how policymakers talk about this in some ways does influence public opinion and change public opinion, is we need to stop this dichotomy between solar and wind and all fossil fuels, right? We need to start lumping all clean together to build public support for all clean, because we need all clean, right? As David said earlier, we need every arrow in the quiver on this. We need, clean, gas-fired power plants. We need retrofits to coal plants. We need ways to capture the carbon dioxide from heavy industry. We need advanced nuclear reactors. We need it all. And one thing I do worry about is so often with clean, we say clean and we mean wind and solar. Actually, that can't be the solution. None of the energy modeling says that's the solution. We need it all. And that's a place that I think public opinion is actually a little behind where we need to get on policy. And
Thanks. I wanted to drill down a little bit more as well on this question of public lands. So one of the things that I've been keeping an eye on as kind of a marker of where the current administration is offshore wind, which is public land even though it's underwater. But there's been a lot of attention to drilling and mining on public land. So do you know more about how the public thinks about, this common resource? And like the Forest Service slogan is like land of many uses. But the challenge is always how do you balance those various uses. So you mentioned that there was the question about comparing the different uses for energy purposes, but I wonder if you're able to expand any more on kind of what the public thinks about using the public land or maybe more generally public resources for these different energy options.
In a word, no.
Okay, sorry. I should have prepared these questions in advance.
It's not that we haven't asked some additional questions. It's that I think most people really haven't thought very deeply about these issues, which is, my training is in the field of communication, and I've learned that you ask people questions, they will give you answers. People are wonderful in that way. But the answers tend to be more meaningful to the extent to which they have really thought about the issues. And people tend to think about the issues when we treat them like adults and we ask them to. We give them information, we engage them. And so I think that what we're seeing about, the public response to how to use the highest and best uses of our public resources, including energy production on public lands, is probably about an inch deep. And therefore very susceptible to sustained engagement of good common sense propositions.
Traditionally, it does seem that traditionally there's been support of Congress, bipartisan support really, in utilizing resources, developing resources that are in the public offer, so to speak. Long before we understood the concerns around climate change, there was an intuitive understanding that incentivizing and helping development and encouraging new industry and economic growth using the public lands was a proper and positive role for government. I think that should, it's nice to see that the polling is bearing that out with respect to clean energy. As we start to understand a little bit more some of the pitfalls associated with extractive approaches in fossil industry, it really is incumbent on the government to do what they can to help incentivize the best and most productive use of that land in terms of providing economic benefit, but also all the other ancillary benefits that are associated with clean energy development, right? Because we know there's a cost to climate change, we know there's a cost to air pollution, right? And the public is bearing that cost, really. So to the extent that we can put public lands to the best use, really, not just about economic growth from a private sector standpoint, but also produces these ancillary benefits for the public. I think the wisdom of seeing more development of public lands with respect to renewables becomes clear.
So in that, it is pretty shocking to see in the recent executive orders that benefits are completely off the table. We can only count costs, and that's a real tragedy. All right, you guys have been very patient. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions. If you don't mind identifying yourself. And I will repeat the question for the purpose of our video, which is not live, but will go on the website tonight. So hopefully we'll have some online viewers, and I want to make sure that they can hear the question. So this person I know, so I'll let him introduce himself.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Joel. I'm energy policy graduate student at George Mason. Frequently when you go to see the climate change and energy conversation, it really focuses on the supply side. So alternative energies, advanced reactors, CCS, there tends to be a lot of consensus. One area that I'm struggling with to see where there is actually more consensus is the area where we've actually progressed most in carbon reduction, which is energy efficiency. About 2.5% versus about 1.3% per year. Is there maybe Rich, this is for you, is there perhaps a discontinuity between the idea of promoting clean energy and reducing consumption? I look at Energy Star, who knows, is it going to go away? But here is a truly successful program that has been effective in reducing consumption. What is your sense about the importance of continuing this most significant source of carbon reduction in the U.S.?
So I will say this much less eloquently, I'm sorry. But the question is about energy efficiency and its role in shifting to a cleaner energy system and the public role in that.
I'll answer very quickly in that our organization's belief on this are a little bit mixed. So the way we see the United States, the highest and best use that we can play right now is as a test bed for technologies, new technologies that will then be deployed and sold across the world. And it is a problem to test new technologies if energy demand in the United States stays flat or declines going forward. That is a problem. I don't know how to square those two things. I acknowledge that there are a lot of cost negative opportunities in energy efficiency, but when we think about the bigger picture, I'm not actually sure it's net beneficial to getting us to the global solution. If what we're really trying to do is build a lot of advanced nuclear reactors here, a lot of advanced carbon capture plants, we have a lot of grid-scale storage that can then be deployed around the rest of the world.
This is where I might have some disagreement with my friend here, because we believe that obviously energy efficiency is absolutely critical to getting to where we need by certain points in time, let's say mid-century, with respect to reducing emissions. The problem is that the market actually doesn't incentivize energy efficiency, right? So it actually takes, there's very little incentive for these utilities to essentially invest in that, right? And even if you try to use the power marketing administrations of the federal, the owned utilities, and try to force them to do certain things with respect to that, they've got ratepayers too, right? And people like the rates. If they're happy with the rates, they don't want them mucking around as a quote unquote test test bed in that respect, with respect to investing in energy, making some of these different types of technology investments and how that actually impacts ratepayers. So I look at it as playing with the incentives and market reform are absolutely crucial to be able to incentivize wider adoption of energy efficiency. So far, it's purely been the consumer's benefit, right? And so they like that. And so you've seen some progress, and then you've seen, of course, federal mandates that are forcing things to be more energy efficient. But the market itself is not necessarily demanding those kinds of investments out of utilities. And that's why it's really important that we look at market reforms that can really value services that currently have no value in the marketplace, but other than to the base consumers. How can we value them in a way where they have a lot of value to the utilities themselves? I think that's the problem we've got to solve, and that's through market reforms and policy. That's the way I see it.
I think there is one way to square this circle, and that's electrification of transportation and ultimately of heat as well. So we could see, I mean, I'm kind of with you, Rich, that without growth, it is hard to innovate. And so at least with regard to the electricity sector, the growth is going to have to come from new uses. And there are good arguments for that from a carbon decarbonization point of view. Transportation has surpassed electricity as the largest source of carbon emissions in the U.S. So we're going to have to move that way, in my view, one way or another. And so you could see electricity market growth along with efficiency at the same time in that kind of a scenario. But I think that's challenging, and we're not really on the ramp yet for that, from what I can see. Yeah, here.
Devin Gladden with AAA National. I'm curious, in terms of public opinion polling, do you see greater divisions when you apply the clean energy questions to a particular sector like transportation, so that, for example, the renewable fuel standard versus electric vehicles becomes much more of a politically divisive question?
So the question, if I can just paraphrase it, has to do with specific clean energy policies, and how do those, to what extent does the consensus hold when specific questions are asked about clean energy?
Yeah, when you ask questions that have political meaning, you will get political polarization. What I find surprising in our own work and everybody else's work that I read is how clean energy really has is so much less politically loaded than so many of the related topics of public dialogue. So in the particular, the question that I was citing before about the public essentially wants public money to be used to help consumers make the transition, that question included both home solar and electric vehicles. So in this case, it was conflated. If we were to deconflate them and ask them separately, they would both, we'd see strong support for both.
Yeah, more questions. Right here.
Yeah, Joel Creswell, legislative assistant for Congressman Ansky from Illinois. And I wanted a reaction from, at least from Ed and Robert and Rich, on the idea of putting a price on carbon emissions. You know, the idea of a revenue neutral carbon tax, or some people don't like to call it a tax, a lot of people just say carbon pricing. It's one that's been gaining steam, I think, among both parties. There's certainly a couple of prominent Republican groups that have been pushing the idea of late. And, you know, in an environment where we're looking for revenue sources to reform the tax code, that's one that's been proposed. And so, Ed, I'm wondering if you have done research on opinions on that, and then, you know, Robert and Rich, curious as to how you guys see that fitting into our sort of, you know, energy economy of the future.
So the question is about carbon pricing, and given its recent prominence in certain Republican circles, as well as the prospect of a tax bill and the need for revenue moving forward this year.
In this same survey, our most recent survey, we asked a number of questions, including, before we got into any other details, we sort of laid out the basic proposition that for governments who would like to reduce, I can't remember exactly how we asked it, global warming pollution perhaps, there are two basic options. You can regulate the emissions, tax the emissions, and so we ask people, which is the option that you prefer? Regulating, taxing, neither, or both? I was stunned by the answers, stunned. The most popular response, I believe it was 49% overall, both. We have looked, because I work with former Congressman Bob Inglis very closely, he is very strongly in support of a revenue neutral tax swap. We have looked a lot at this notion of revenue neutrality. You know, you can tax carbon, and then what do you do with the money? You know, one proposition is let's make it revenue neutral, and within that proposition, there's a variety of ways to do that. You can lower the corporate tax rate, you can lower the individual tax rate, you can lower payroll taxes. And then there are a whole lot of other possible priorities. We find that that if there is going to be a tax, revenue neutral is not the preferred option by most Americans. They see some other higher priorities, number one of which is accelerating the transition to clean energy.
Sure. Yeah. Our organization obviously thinks a carbon tax is critical. It's not the only way we can get to where we want to be, but it's potentially the most efficient way to do that. The key would be, of course, how high is that carbon tax, and that makes a big difference, right? So, to the extent it's something weak, that's potentially problematic. As far as the revenue issue, the revenues are essentially what sell the policy, right? And I think people should be taking a very hard look at that. I think what we've seen in terms of studying the momentum of that as a viable political option has really been more ideological. But as the opportunities to raise revenue get less and less, and given the polling on this, that people actually see this as a pragmatic approach to dealing with a real problem. I'm heartened by the fact that a lot more Republican surrogates are talking about the value and the benefit of this policy. And if we can get a little less polarized and less ideological politically, create some more political space back home in these states and districts of these members to be able to articulate the value of what that revenue can do and what the policy does with respect to its impact on reducing emissions and how that benefits communities. Ultimately, you'd like to think we'd get there. Again, we're up against the clock and it's tough, but we've got to have a price on carbon to incentivize different behavior. Something to mention, though, that I think is really important, doesn't get raised enough, is how that additional cost is kind of outsourced to customers, who pays, who really actually has to take the burden from that. And just something to think a little bit about is, of course, that, big users of electricity, big apartment buildings and so forth, the more that kind of gets passed on to low-income people, it's a concern. So how you actually develop the policy, the way that the mechanics of the policy work are absolutely critical. And so it's got to be something where folks in environmental justice community or people who have low-income considerations are at the table in the process of developing that policy, so that it's ultimately a policy that works for everyone, and a lot of the equity issues associated with it are addressed. But in my opinion, it's the policy we need to be pushing forward to actually deal with the problem in a market-based way.
So this is another area where I think Rob and I and David differ. ClearPath does not support a carbon pricing instrument. That's for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, it is a highly divisive topic on the Hill. One of the most divisive topics, I think, right now. So if we're sort of talking about where is there bipartisan consensus, there is not bipartisan consensus on the need for a carbon price. I think folks try to tell the story that there's one emerging. It is not emerging. There's a strong vote, I think, of the entire Republican caucus. Speaking of my ClearPath Action hat on our caucus, I believe voted against, on a resolution against the carbon tax in this last cycle. And so I always worry about tying a carbon price to innovation policy, because I worry we can sort of infect a highly bipartisan debate with a highly partisan debate. So that's one. Two, I do think we have to remember that a pricing instrument is not really an innovation policy. It's actually primarily an efficiency policy, right? That's mostly what people do when energy gets more expensive. They actually tend to use less energy as opposed to switching to cleaner energy sources. I think ITIF a couple years ago did a great report which showed that the effective carbon price of many European countries' gas taxes is $600 a ton. And they still have not switched to electric vehicles by and large in Europe, so it hasn't driven innovation the way that some folks thought that very high carbon pricing might actually drive innovation. And first of all, there's no good track record of anybody achieving any kind of very high, formal carbon pricing like that anywhere in the world. I think the Europeans were hoping that they'd be somewhere in the kind of the 70 euro range by now, and their carbon markets have sort of struggled to get north of $10 a ton, right? So even getting to the high carbon prices where you might think innovation starts happening has proven almost entirely politically unrealistic. And then even in the places where you sort of have these niche carbon taxes that have gotten this high, they don't really seem to have driven a lot of innovation, which we think is key. In our view, it's just a lot cheaper and easier to just drive the innovation, right? I mean, the shale gas revolution, if you look back at what that cost, that was about $500 million in direct spending at the DOE over the course of about 2 decades on, hydraulic or horizontal drilling technologies and hydraulic fracturing and diamond head drilling. It's $500 million. And then followed on with some deployment subsidies for alternative gas in the sort of low single-digit billions, right? That's what it cost. And that has produced a dramatic dislocation in the carbon intensity of our markets. As we just really look at there's an academic argument for carbon pricing, but as we look at the actual track record of policies, as we see it, innovation beats pricing hands down. And until some other country sort of, demonstrates a miracle of carbon pricing, we certainly don't think that all of the political baggage that comes along with it is worth the effort.
So you sort of stole my point, so I have a paper which is out there about the various forms of magical thinking, and I think one form of magical thinking is to believe that the carbon price will solve the innovation problem. That said, I do think they're complementary, and I'm going to have to get your data, Ed, that shows that, because one of my disappointments with the plan that Felstein and others put out this fall, was this fixation on revenue neutrality without the notion that some portion of this should be fed back in to remedy the other market failure that everybody recognized, which is that we can't generate knowledge without some public source of funding. So my own view is that they're complementary, but certainly a carbon price alone is not going to solve the innovation challenge. And if we jumped it up to $600 a ton right away, we would have some other issues. We're not going to get to EVs overnight with that kind of a policy. Other questions? Yeah, here.
Yeah, so Drew Bond with Edgewater Strategies. Just a little background. So I worked on that Hill at one point as a legislative assistant for a senator from Oklahoma. Then moved on to be the chief of staff at the Heritage Foundation, and then president and CEO of townhall.com, very conservative organizations. And then later joined the Bush administration as a senior advisor within the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. And some people thought I had sort of left the ranch, and yet it was what excited me about this space was what you guys are describing, which is it doesn't have to be a us versus them, clean versus dirty, renewables versus fossil. There really is a lot of room in the room, if you will, to bring in environmentalists who want to save the earth, to bring in conservatives who want and love the competition of ideas and free markets, and whether you're most concerned about climate change or you're most concerned about energy security, there's a lot of room for folks in that same room. And just by way of a perfect example, and I'm getting to the question, the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative is something that we launched in partnership with the state of Hawaii. And it was really, I think, looking back at it now and seeing all the progress that's been made, is a perfect public-private partnership where the state really led the way, the federal government supported, and it underscores to me that there's not a one-size-fits-all for energy. I mean, the state of Hawaii alone, every island is different. So what works in Oahu doesn't work in Kauai, doesn't work in the Big Island. I think this is a breath of fresh air. I hope that you'll continue this dialogue, continue to publish papers, and I think there ought to be a lot more discussions around DC about how there's plenty of room for agreement in this. My question is, so oftentimes on the language we get caught up, or the sort of buzzwords, and so I'm wondering, you talk to a Secretary of Energy, Governor Perry, whose state is very pro-renewable energy, very pro-energy, all the above. And I would suspect as he goes around to town hall meetings, he probably has a lot of folks in those meetings that are pro-renewable energy. They're farmers, they're ranchers, they're innovators, you name it. They've benefited in some way. But then oftentimes people throw out this grenade of, we don't want to pick winners or losers. So people get sort of stuck there because just philosophically, I'm like, yeah, I don't want to do that. I don't want to pick winners or losers. So I'm just wondering if you guys encountered any of that and what your recommendations are as sort of dealing with that discussion.
So from a former member of the Heritage Foundation staff, a nice praise for the panel saying we can find some common ground on this theme and we should be talking about that more. And then a question about picking winners and losers and whether that can lead the conversation about clean energy into a kind of cul-de-sac.
I don't really have a direct answer to your question because we've never actually looked at that. But earlier I wanted to say something and the conversation just morphed in a different direction, so I'll say it now. This may be a universal ethic. It's certainly a universal American ethic. We don't like waste, right? We're definitely down on the idea of wasting. We don't personally want to be wasteful. We don't want our community to be wasteful. We don't want our nation to be wasteful. So that is a really, really strong thing that we have going for us, and sort of in response to your question about, how do we think about and what is the, where is the tractionability of the proposition of improving our energy efficiency? Efficiency is just another way of thinking about waste. But on the other hand, we don't like to be told what to do. And that's less universal, but I think liberals don't mind to be told what to do quite as much as conservatives really dislike being told what to do. So there is a bit of a tension between disliking waste and aspiring to waste less and not being told, want to be told how to do it, or sort of coming to your notion of winners and losers. So I think lots of these issues have two sides, two ways of representing the same idea, and I suspect the public will be very, different segments within the public will be differentially susceptible to different framings. And I do think that you've got your thumb on exactly the right issue about, the notion of picking winners and losers is one that does make lots of us very uncomfortable.
I've heard that phrase before, a few times up here. And the way, what I think people mean when they say, I think it's a good catchphrase for political expediency for a variety of reasons, but I think people are saying essentially, well, I feel more comfortable letting the market sort it out. And that's probably the same reason why it's so hard for us to pass some sort of federal energy mandate, like a particular standard for clean energy or renewables, for example. One size fits all, people tend to, at least at the federal level, it doesn't seem like people are as supportive. They'd rather have, the states have the flexibility to make their own determinations about what they want. But I would just say maybe devil's advocate, we pick winners and losers all the time, and it's about, investing in what's working is not a foolish enterprise. It makes sense to me. And we've also picked winners and losers with respect to policy. And it's just the policy avenues that we've chosen that somehow make it more acceptable. It's still the same thing. I mean, when we're giving away free drilling rights or essentially incentivizing certain behavior because we want economic growth, we want to develop jobs, and that's the way we think we can do it, that is picking a winner and loser. And we know that the playing field is not level because we know the externalities associated with burning fossil fuels are not priced into the market, and that some of those costs are being borne by the public, right? So I understand the interest in having a market and essentially allowing the market to dictate what rises to the top. And I think it's unfair to say that the market right now is an equitable market and that we're not already in some ways through different avenues picking winners and losers already. And I think it's about getting to basically a level playing field best we can, where we're, I think, collectively recognizing the benefits that certain, not individual technologies, but what are the priorities, what are the principles that we want to see out of the types of energy sources that we decide we want to throw our weight behind. And how do we actually provide an opportunity for energy sources to compete truly equally in a market where all those externalities are priced in and where it's truly a level playing field. Under that circumstance, I agree, we shouldn't be picking winners and losers, but until we get to that point, I think it's really prudent to incentivize certain behaviors and certain approaches and certain technologies that kind of reflect, the values that we'd like to see in our energy mix. So basically things that are better for the public welfare.
First, Drew, good to see you in person. If you need any help with that Hawaii project, I would be willing to come and spend any amount of time on any one of those islands. I do, the problem with the phrase picking winners and losers is that it's inconvenient because there's a lot of truth to it, right? In this past, I think in this past 8 years, we did see sort of a hard swing away from a kind of all of the above sort of clean energy policy, exemplified sort of in the Bush administration, where you had a lot of work on EERE, and renewables were fairly well accepted by conservatives, and work on making the nuclear renaissance happen and getting the Clean Coal Power Initiative going, a very kind of all of the above clean energy approach. And really, we had a swing over the past 8 years. I think it's hard to argue against this, away from that and towards an approach that looked a lot more like 100% renewables and efficiency in electric vehicles. And that vision of our energy system is so far-fetched to many people, me included, that I think it's like shooting fish in a barrel, right? It is just so easy to say, wow, that looks really unrealistic. These people aren't serious about the energy system. They're picking winners and losers. And I think there's truth to that. I think there's real truth to that. I think it was not a helpful swing in our innovation policy. And so I'm very hopeful that Secretary Perry, who I think is a broader view on the technology ambit, will help us swing that pendulum back toward a more all of the above clean energy approach. Look, frankly, technology is innovation is a technology specific game. You have to make bets about which things you're going to fund in basic research and things you aren't. I mean, we're going to try to just pick winners, but we are going to. I mean, we have to make choices between them. But I think so long as we swing back to a place where we got a much broader ambit, where we are equally supporting all of the clean energy technologies, or taking our thumb a bit off the scale. My hope is that over the next 4 years, we're going to end up in a better place rhetorically, and the power of that message is going to go away. That's my hope.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'm Gina Hall from the Farming Trust. I'm hearing a lot of consensus around having all of the above, good mix in the energy system, which is, I think we do need a lot in all of the above. But I've only heard Mr. Cowan talk about an urgency. There's a clock, and I'm just wondering, and there is an urgency, I believe. What does your constituency feel about the urgency of making that shift to a cleaner energy system?
The question is to Rich.
Yes.
Yeah, so the question is to Rich about the urgency of the energy transition.
We certainly think it's an urgent transition. We would like to see DOE dramatically accelerate the pace of a lot of its innovation programs. Right now, the Advanced Reactor Program, I think, has a desire to demonstrate 1 advanced reactor by 2030. We'd love to see them demonstrate 4 by 2027. We think that that's possible. Right now, there is no timeline that we can really see on the carbon capture program. We would love to see that dramatically accelerated. I mean, we're going to need to be building a lot of these things in the 2030s and the 2040s. We need to be demonstrating them in the mid to late 2020s. What we're doing right now at DOE in the innovation space is not a policy emergency. It does not ramp up to any kind of full-on decarbonization. We need the whole thing to get a lot more urgent, and unfortunately, that means we need to make it a lot more fortunately, we need to make it a lot more focused. Right now, if you go to the national laboratories, which are amazing places, full of amazing people and amazing technology, they talk like they're a consulting firm. You get these slideshows about, we have 1,000 capabilities, we can do anything, right? What they don't talk about is like, here are the 2 really big things we're working on right now, and here's the deadline that we're going to deliver them by, because this is all very urgent. And so I don't know where that message was lost in the past few years, but we used to have, I think Sunshot, again, was a shining example of where we actually did have urgency. We had a time-based economic goal. The Joint Bioenergy Initiative, the JBA program out of the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, fantastic work, strong leader, 9 years of dedicated funding. They've made incredible breakthroughs in drop-in equivalent lignocellulosic biofuels. The the Center for Artificial Photosynthesis, sort of same thing. Unfortunately, we had that urgency really only on the pieces of the efficiency and renewable side, and we had very little urgency on the whole rest of the picture. And I hope that we can instill more of that, now in DOE in this next cycle.
Can I respond?
Yeah, please do.
So I'm incredibly fortunate that I am physically embedded at George Mason with climate scientists. So the social science group and the physical science group, we are all together. My climate science colleagues, their heads are going, I always worry that their heads are going to explode. They feel such a potent sense of urgency, such a potent sense of concern that we don't really know, at which point do we hit a tipping point in the climate system that is virtually irreversible. They know that is a very real intangible risk. They just don't know how far off in the future it is, how far you have to push the climate system to trigger one of those tipping points, but they feel it. My job, I study what's in the public's head and heart. The average American sees the average American absolutely accepts that climate change is happening. Most of us accept that it's human cause, but the average American sees it as a very distant threat. Distant in time, it's like a 21st century thing, not so much a 2017 thing. Distant in space, people are more likely to be hurt in Bangladesh than in Bangalore, Maine. And distant, Bangor, sorry, Bangalore, thank you. And distant in species, it's very much it's that poor bedraggled plains, penguins, and polar bears problem and not a people problem. So there's this real disconnect between the way the American public understands the issue, the reason, and they don't feel that, most of them don't feel that sense of urgency because of this psychological distance that they are using to interpret what little they are hearing, because they do hear very, very little. So it's really an open question. At what point does this become a more potent voting issue, political issue? And what does it take to help the Americans understand the magnitude and the urgency of the issue?
Can I just speak one point on that about, with respect to innovation, yeah, the urgency of innovation, we absolutely need to be ramping up our research and development for potential game-changing technologies. The sooner that those can come to fruition, the better off we are. We also need to be really urgent about deploying what we have now. And that's why policies like the Loan Guarantee Program, while maybe not focused on early stage, kind of pure R&D development, but trying to get across the unit death or valley death.
I think either or.
Are so important, right? Getting things from that stage of demonstration to commercialization. That's why tax credit policy to incentive more deployment is absolutely critical. We're incentivizing more electrification of other sectors like the industrial sector or the transportation sector. What can we use tax policy to do that? So really, let's throw everything we can as quickly as we can at the wall. Let's do the long game, but let's see what we can do. Can we deploy the tools we have as quickly as possible? That, to me, is really part of this question of addressing urgency.
So one last question right here. Go ahead.
One area that I see of disagreement is in
You just
terms of,
identify yourself.
I'm sorry, Capital R from New Scale Power. One area of disagreement that I really see is in terms of jobs. I think that Americans are for transitioning to clean energy unless it's threatening their fossil fuel job, for example. And I recently heard a government official from California state that there are more clean energy jobs in California than there are coal mining jobs in the entire country, which is great, but doesn't help the coal miners because those jobs are in California. So how do you address that difference?
So the question is about jobs and displacement, especially in the fossil fuel sector.
Jobs is another thing that Americans agree on. Like that's priority one, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum. Your point is very well taken. We want to create more jobs, but don't take mine away from me, okay, please. And coming back to the topic that I addressed earlier, we asked people in our most recent survey, are you for regulating? Are you for taxing? Neither or both. People who told us they were for taxing, we asked them essentially, well, how would you like to see the proceeds spent? And again, you just can't, you never know until you ask. And one of the most surprising findings from that survey is is the proportion of the tax revenue, this is all hypothetical, but the proportion of the hypothetical dollar raised from a carbon tax, people want to see a significant portion of that spent to make people in the coal industry in particular, to make them whole. And that really surprised me. I wasn't aware that if you take a national perspective, that you would get Americans from every corner of the country saying, no, that's a real problem. We don't want to hurt those people by essentially taking their jobs from them. We want a certain amount of justice in this transition. I think that's a very heartwarming finding.
Can I just add, I think that this is a major issue in the movement, and I think for too long the movement has used some job numbers maybe somewhat misleadingly, right? A $15 an hour job installing rooftop solar panels is not as good as an $80,000 or $90,000 a year job working in a coal mine, right? There's more risk in the coal job, but it's a worse job, right? It's much harder to be the sole supporter of a family on a $15 an hour, $30K a year job than a $90K a year job. And there's not that much sun in West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky and other parts of Appalachia, right? And we have not grappled with that, right? We've pretended like there won't be losers in a transition like this. And so it's just another reason that I think when we're talking about clean energy, we need to be as inclusive as possible. If there is any possible way that our clean energy transition can include a lot of coal with carbon capture and keep as many of those jobs as possible going, so as few people are hurt and dislocated as possible, why wouldn't we do everything we could to sort of make sure that that happened alongside advanced reactors and a share of renewables and all that? And I think being more honest about this and inclusive and making sure that we're doing right by people and, if at all possible, maintaining their jobs in those value chains, I think all the better for the political economy of this.
So we've reached our witching hour, and I guess I just want to close by saying thank you to Ed, especially. You can find his work at the George Mason Center for Climate Change Communications, and hope we have some new customers for your work, because I think it's really important, and it does show, as we've heard from the other panelists today, that there is a broad consensus on many aspects of this issue, and it's important for us to work towards that if we're going to make a policy that's going to be durable. And we've seen a lot of fluctuation in the policy, and partly because it doesn't rest on a strong enough consensus. Thank you as well to Rob Cowett from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Rich Powell from ClearPath, and especially to those of you who took time out of your days to join us here. Look forward to seeing you again at other ITIF events on the Hill or at our home office down the street on K Street. Thank you.